And joining us for a health check on U.S. banking, we have a top-rated analyst, CLSA's Mike Mayo. In fact, the Bloomberg terminal rates him #1 on Morgan Stanley, Bank of New York, and Citigroup. And you've been credited by Fortune magazine and CNN with being one of the 8 that saw the financial crisis coming in 2008. You got a new book here, Mike Mayo. What's it called?
Exile on Wall Street.
One analyst fight to save the big banks from themselves, right?
Exactly.
There you go. Mike Mayo's new edition here for the coffee tables, out soon in just about 6 weeks' time,
Exactly.
you say. All right, well, let's talk about the world of banking. I'm going to give that back to you. Very precious cargo. You know, we got this Fed Operation Twist overnight. You used to work at the Fed. Any surprises for you in this announcement?
Well, it was not a big surprise. The Fed telegraphed that pretty well. But the remarkable part for the U.S. banks is the flatter yield curve. I mean, who thought a 10-year Treasury bond would be below 2% right now?
Yeah.
And that's a crushing blow to bank margins and bank revenues, and it's tough to get around that.
Exactly. 30-year note below 3% yields, which is, I think, the lowest in 2 years or something like that. So what does that mean for banks? Are you going to take a look back at the financial sector? Because you're right, their margins do get crimped. I mean, they don't make as much money on interest by loaning out their cash.
Well, when you step back, this is likely to be the worst revenue growth year for U.S. banks since 1938. It's likely to be the worst.
The Great Depression?
Was the decade. This is likely to be the worst revenue decade for U.S. banks since the decade of the Great Depression. So there's enormous headwinds taking place, and no professional bank manager has experienced something like this.
So this is the lost decade for U.S. banks. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it's not necessarily for the banks, but it's the lost decade when it comes to U.S. bank revenues, which means banks have to get tougher on expenses and risk control.
And what does that mean? That means cutting headcount, doesn't it?
Well, there's many ways to skin a cat. I mean, you can pay people a lot less, you can reduce branches, you can use technology to become more efficient, you can pursue acquisitions to try to get expense savings.
Didn't you say right now they're trying to use a pocket knife when they should be using a machete?
Well, I think the industry's been a little late. We've been writing about this for a year and a half. Our overall theme is that the U.S. is a lighter version of what's taken place in Japan. We call it Japan Light. And at CLSA, I'm at the annual investor conference right now, and there's over a couple thousand people there. And the sentiment is coming around to our theme of Japan Light. And we've been on this for a couple years, yet many banks only recently started to announce expense control programs.
Right.
A little late.
It's a little late in your view. Okay,
Yes.
So what about this Moody's downgrade? So you're kind of like, oh, I already saw this coming, right?
Well, it's interesting, the Moody's downgrade. Last week, we lowered our price targets because we termed the U.S. banks, in addition to Japan Light, Crisis Light. So when Europe sneezes, the U.S. catches cold, and we need to reflect some more Crisis Light prices in the U.S. banks until we get through this situation in Europe.
Yeah, now, I believe Wells Fargo is one of your better picks, or that you think is a better pick in the banking sector. Were you surprised that Wells Fargo is part of this downgrade?
You know, Wells Fargo, that is one of the safe haven names we recommend. We have mostly, you know, underrated, underperformed, sell-rated stocks among the banks that we cover.
Yeah.
But the reason for the downgrade, the way I read it, was the government's not going to stop in and save the banks in terms of times of difficulty. I'll believe that when I see it, but that was the rationale.
So you still think there's still institutions that are too big to fail, that the government will step in and stop from what happened with Lehman's?
Well, CLSA, again, I'm at the annual conference here in Hong Kong, but I had my own conference with CLSA back in March, and I polled the audience. How many people think the big banks are still too big to fail? And this is hedge fund managers, mutual fund managers, some people at the banks, and the percentage that came back was 96% of these very sophisticated investors said that U.S. banks are still too big to fail, and they would never be allowed to fail.
Okay, so with what's happening in Europe, what are your thoughts in terms of how this is going to play out? Are we going to see a default in Greece? Is this going to mean contagion? Is this going to hit the banks? Are we going to see a banking crisis like what Ella Arian said at PIMCO?
Well, we've already seen an impact on U.S. banks. You've seen some large U.S. banks lower their expectations for capital market revenue. So investment banking, trading, stock market sensitive revenues, and generally the risk off trades. So to the extent that investors are less likely to put capital to work, corporations are less likely to invest, consumers are pulling back some. You've already seen the impact on the U.S. banks. And then there's the flight to quality with the treasuries that flatten the yield curve and further hurt revenues.
Okay, so Mike, I know you usually cover U.S. banks. You're here in the Asia Pacific. I think you're once a year jaunt or a few times a year. Can you compare for me the banking sector in the U.S. to Asia? Is Asia more impressive in your view as it has been to weather this global downturn?
Well, we have a fantastic Asian bank research team, close to a dozen senior analysts, and we were at dinner the other night. And they've lowered their expectations for Asian banks. So I'll change the analogy I had earlier, when Western economies sneeze, Asia can potentially catch cold.
Oh, okay.
But having said that, we sat around the table and said, what kind of revenue growth do you think Asian banks will have?
Right.
Because in the U.S., it's going to be the worst year since 1938. And the response was, it should still be over 10% revenue growth for Asian
That's
banks.
pretty good.
So you're much less leveraged in Asia,
Okay.
stronger growth prospects.
All right. Now, Mike, you have the CLSA paraphernalia. Put it on. Might as well just give a shout-out to your bank there, CLSA, Asia Pacific Markets?
I don't go anywhere without my CLSA banker's hat, and this helps to remind me that we really better look at the numbers very closely. Remember the old green eye shades? Well, at CLSA, we have green and blue eye shades to make sure we understand the numbers.
And that's right, you're going to Christina Aguilera tonight, right? She's performing the big gala.
This is the biggest conference I've ever been to. It's the most impressive conference. It's sizzling. It really is.
It looks like you're running for president, actually. There you go. Here at CLSA.